Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm thrilled to have Nathen Amin with us. He has been very busy lately because of all of the discussions and controversies surrounding the recent book, The Princes in the Tower, the outcome of the Richard III Society's Missing Princes Project. And Nathen is a really important voice in this. And unfortunately, I feel like I'm just apologizing for Americans today, but unfortunately, his words were cut out of the thing that appeared on PBS. The documentary was shortened, and so we didn't get to hear from him. So I wanted all of us to be able to hear from him. So welcome, Nathen. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm always happy to riff off the top of my head about this subject. So who knows where this conversation is going to go.
Well, and that's always exciting. I love that about you. So let me just say that in some of the recent coverage, and that includes this is just a Wall Street Journal article I just pulled to show it is being covered in the US as well. And I have been reading the coverage in the UK. You're sometimes identified as the quote voice of dissent, which I love. And I think you kind of wear that proudly. The Richard III Society's conclusion, based on looking at some pretty interesting documents, their conclusion is the two sons of Edward IV. And it seems like everybody's named either Richard or Edward. So we have to be really identifying which Edward and which Richard. So Edward IV had two sons named, of course, Edward and Richard, as well as a brother named Richard. And so the Richard III Society has concluded that those two boys survived 1483 and in fact lived on to challenge Henry VII. So that is not a conclusion you necessarily share. So can you tell us why you don't agree with the conclusion?
I think there's a very decent quote that's very apropos at this moment, said by the wisest man who's ever lived, Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones, where a wise man said you should never believe a thing simply because you want to believe it. Now, I think that applies to Ricardians in this debate. It also applies to myself in this debate. You know, the problem we're always going to have is that there are two sides who, it doesn't matter what evidence is going to be shown at this stage, there's going to be enough doubt to allow everyone to maintain, the status quo. Now, the Richard III Society, the Missing Princes Project, they are taking their discoveries as a fact that this case has now been solved.
Right.
I have finished Philippa Langley's book. I am in the process of reviewing it. It is a good book, even though I don't agree with the conclusions. But you can see, as the book goes on, it is now a fact in her mind and in the mind of many people who follow her story, that this has been solved. And it hasn't been solved. We are simply never going to get a smoking gun in this case. It happened too long ago.
Right.
There's been too much passage of time. Even if we take recent events, recent political events, etc., we have two sides in America, we have two sides in Britain, and it doesn't matter what evidence that we can see with our own eyes is put in front of us, people are going to take different viewpoints. We're not going to get the Prince of the Tower ever solved. It's simply not going to happen. There's too much rebuttals. Myself and Matt Lewis, we regularly debate on this subject. We debate too much, in fact, at the moment. I'm kind of getting a bit tired of him coming at me with his viewpoints and me rebutting it and back and forth, because everything that we say to each other, there is an answer, a possible answer to. My viewpoint, quite simply, without getting into hours and hours of detail, when it comes to the Princes in the Tower, they were murdered, in my opinion, which I can't prove. They were murdered, in my opinion, during the reign of Richard III, because that simply was the most likeliest thing that could have happened. He was faced with dynastic threats. Regardless of whether they were made illegitimate or not, they had to go. The fact that they came back later, or pretenders came back later, or even if they were the real princes, came back later under Henry VII, is just proof that they were always going to be a threat to him. Quite simply, they disappear in the summer of 1483, and we can come up with any theories as to what happened to them after 1483, but the fact remains they did disappear in 1483 under the reign of Richard III. I simply view all other theories, which once more may not be wrong, view all other theories as falling in behind that. Again, to give a modern comparison, although I'm not sure how controversial this might be to American listeners, it's the O.J. Simpson case. He's found not guilty. There's not enough proof to have found him guilty, although I can't say I'm an expert on the case. But simply, it still remains to this day the most likeliest, in fact, possibly the only theory, I think, in that case that's out there. But just because that case couldn't get over the line doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. I think it's similar with the Princes in the Tower. We haven't got enough evidence to convict Richard, but I don't think we've got enough evidence either to completely absolve him. And we remain where we always were.
Okay, so you were not swayed by the documents. So they did find some interesting documents in the additional research. And that is one thing about Philippa, as she really does her work. And she certainly deserves a lot of credit for finding the remains of Richard III. I mean, she works really hard at it. I think you're right. I think she's looking for a particular answer and she knows what she's looking for. But why do you not think those documents sort of hold up that appear, according to her, to identify the living Edward or the living Richard past 1483?
The problem is that the documents are simply, they're just additions to the other weight of evidence and context that we already have. So let's take the payment, for example, the bill for 400 pikes. Now, this is a fascinating document that I think gives the theory that Lambert Simnel was not an impersonation of Edward of Warwick, but was in fact the real Edward V. I think that gives that theory a bit more legs. However, when we add in the wider context of this time, it still doesn't hold up. Just off the top of my head, when the conspiracy erupted in 1487 against Henry Tudor, there were men attacking his royal members of staff, chanting the Warwick name. There was a rebellion in Coventry, an attempted uprising for the name Warwick. When the rebellion crossed over to Dublin, Dublin was the birthplace of Warwick's father, the Duke of Clarence. So a very obvious place for them to go to try and gain more support. Henry VII brings the real Warwick out of the Tower of London and parades him. So therefore, there is another, proof that Warwick was central to this conspiracy. Even in Philippa Langley's book, she admits that there is chronicle sources in Flanders, in the Low Countries at this time, that suggest this uprising rebellion was for the son of Clarence, Warwick. So one bill of payment, along with one or two other very vague references to Edward V, do not represent a smoking gun. It makes it very interesting. It's a fascinating discovery. It is, any historical document is fascinating, but you have to put them in with the rest of the known evidence, and it's still, the weighted probability is still towards Lambert Simnel being an impersonator for Edward of Warwick. But either way, it's not proven definitively either way. Then we have a couple of other documents referring to Perkin Warbeck. I think the most interesting discovery that they found, and it is termed their proof of life, is they're terming it a witness statement. It's a first-person account written by someone claiming to be Richard of England. Now, this is called the Gelderland document, and it's taken to be the first ever evidence of Richard of England giving proof of life for himself. But, as readers of my book, Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders will know, we did already have a document called the Dendermonde letter, which is written at exactly the same time, and it's almost exactly the same in content. The latest discovery has a few more names, which makes it such a vital document to have. But we already know there was somebody on the continent for years signing letters, calling themselves Richard of England. There were people referring to him as Richard of England. And it simply doesn't change the fact that we already know that. The fact that we have one more letter, well, in fact, two more documents, I think they have referring to Richard of England, simply means that somebody was using the name Richard of England. It doesn't mean that that person signing those letters truly was. So once more, fantastic documents. You know, these are really interesting documents. I believe the Gelderland one, you can now view it online. You can see nice, clear as day, the Richard of England name, but it simply is not a new discovery. And I'll show you quickly what I mean. In 1991, Diana Klein wrote a book called Richard of England with the signature Richard of England. So we simply already know this information. So again, incredible research. I think I've met the lady who discovered this document, Nathen Amin of the Dutch research group. I think what Philip has done is to bring together an army of what I think she terms citizen researchers to just delve in the archives, because universities and professional historians haven't got the time or money to do this. So I think that is what is incredibly commendable, but it's not a smoking gun.
Right. And that's something that I really appreciate you making so clear. The research is really valuable. These documents are wonderful to have. They don't necessarily shift the story or shift the conclusion, but it's excellent research and they're really great to have. And we know that someone was pretending to be Richard of England. And if that's who you're pretending to be, that's how you'll sign your name. But
exactly. Or to be generous, maybe Perky Warbeck was Richard of York, but the point remains, we can't prove that. We can only put across these theories, and I think eventually it does come down to a simple matter of faith. This is not something research can really answer. It'll be what is our personal feelings on the matter, our gut instinct, our own biases and so on, and we're going to go with that. But that's why words such as, in my opinion, or we cannot be definitive, are very important with historians.
Okay, so that's something really interesting, because in this Wall Street Journal article, the conclusion of that, I don't know if you've seen this one, points to possible DNA testing of the bones in the urn in Westminster Abbey, who the bones were purported to be of the two princes. And this sort of says, if the bones are unrelated to the skeleton of Richard III, then this book will have refounded the story, as if that DNA test will silence your voice of dissent. So I think that's a really bizarre conclusion, because knowing whose bones they are won't answer all the questions. So talk to us about that story, the likelihood that they are the bones of the princes, but that doesn't really answer the full question.
No, I mean, I'll start by saying I don't science. I don't get science. I don't understand science. I haven't got a clue how it all works. And DNA testing is very much above my head. But what I do know, the basic facts, is that obviously, first of all, the skeletons were discovered in 1674 at a stairwell. Thomas More, in his unpublished work, suggests that the bones were buried at the bottom of the tower, bottom of the stairs. Therefore, everyone's simply gone, it's obviously them. What they never seem to include is that Thomas More then later says, but they were then moved. So Thomas More himself says the bones weren't at the bottom of the stairs. So which one is it? When it comes to whoever these bones are, I think I would probably suggest everyone rush away after this and listen to Turi King, the geneticist who was involved in the exhumation of Richard III. Listen to her podcast she's done very recently, because she can explain it in a way that I simply don't have a clue. I think it comes down to the fact that those bones, it's probably more unlikely they aren't the princes than they are, simply because you just can't find random skeletons in the tower and then assume that they must be the princes. Although that is what most people seem to believe without delving into it. I think the remains have been handled so extensively already in the 1930s that they're contaminated. So I don't even believe that they can be DNA tested. They were interred, I think the quote was something like they were thrown in with chicken and other bones.
Mhm.
So we don't even know if these are human bones. Something to do with the DNA testing about getting the marrow. I just think scientifically, we don't have the technology to be able to do this. And of course, even if we do have the technology and scientists are able to get uncontaminated DNA, and they are able to put together a probability that these were the princes in the tower, apart from completely invalidating Philippa Langley's theories, because then clearly Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel were these boys, it doesn't tell us anything else.
Right.
When were the boys killed? When were they put there? By who were they put there? I don't think bones can tell you how murder happened. And I just think it's a very big red herring in this whole debate. It's just constant DNA, DNA, DNA. And I forget about this, the Westminster Bones, and so does Matt Lewis and so on, because we delve so deep into this case. We already don't believe those. He believes the boys survived. I believe the boys were thrown into the Thames. So neither of us we don't pay much attention to the bones. But obviously, with this case having gone, well, international in the last
Right.
couple of weeks, 95% of comment is about the bones. So I'd almost, let's just get them tested so we can get them out of the way and go back to the history. But my understanding is that it's going to be nigh on impossible to do anything with the bones. But again, I defer to Theory King on this matter.
And she is great. I got to meet her during the Richard III things. She came to the US and we did some education programs, and she is amazing. And when she spoke, I thought I did understand DNA testing. I certainly couldn't explain it to you though, but she is great. And you're right. Whether the bones, if they are the boys, then they didn't survive. If they're not the boys, that really doesn't tell us anything, because except that they're not the boys. So it is unfortunate, and that's why I pointed out that's the case the Wall Street Journal article makes and is basing it on. It's really not an important factor here, so please remember that. Now, one of the people I find really interesting who sometimes gets left out of the story, and I have Sarah Gristwood's book behind me because she wrote a great book, as did, and the reason I don't have your book behind me here, I'll put it up again on my, is that it's on my Kindle because I like to take notes. But this is, let's go to the first page so you can see. This is the book you must also read. I got it there. Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders by Nathen. It is marvelous, and we'll go into so much detail on all these things. So shout out to that. But some of the women are really important in this story, and I think Elizabeth Woodville is somebody really important. And she and Edward IV were married nearly 20 years, and they had several children. And the heir and the spare, she gave him the heir and the spare. The marriage was controversial at the time because she was a commoner. She was a widow who already had children, and her former husband, or her recently deceased husband, had been fighting for the Lancastrians. So he was also on the other side. So it was a controversial marriage, but then they're married for a long time. And it hinges, I mean, the case for Richard hinges on that marriage not being valid. So can we talk a little bit about Elizabeth and her actions and her role in some of this, what happens in 1483 after the death of Edward IV?
I think so. This is what's considered the pre-contract story. The idea that Edward IV had conducted a pre-contract to marry a lady called Eleanor Butler, the daughter of John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. The idea being that because Edward IV had entered a pre-contract to marry Eleanor Butler, his later marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was therefore bigamous. That's the argument that was put forward in the summer of 1483. It came from nowhere. And it does seem to have been very, very convenient timing because I believe it was openly preached in London outside St. Paul's Cathedral by a preacher called Shaw, and it was 4 days before the crown was offered to Richard III.
Mhm.
So now a Ricardian argument would be that this had just been discovered by Bishop Stillington, the Bishop of Bath and Wells. And the reason that it'd always been hidden was because who was going to mention this during the reign of Edward IV? History, is written by the victors and so on, which that does make sense on one hand. That's a good rebuttal. But it still is very convenient that during this period, we seem to have rumors that there's a question, first of all, going around about Edward IV's parentage.
Right.
And then suddenly it pivots to, okay, his marriage must have been bigamous. Edward IV, during this period, was obviously no longer alive to answer for this, and neither was Eleanor Butler. She had died in 1468. So it is a very convenient document that has just suddenly surfaced. What the document shows is therefore the princes in the Tower, the children of Edward IV, were illegitimate. They therefore had to be removed from the line of succession. The next in line was Edward of Warwick, the son of the Duke of Clarence, but he was also exempt from the line of succession because his father had died a traitor, and therefore it was Shaw's view, with this document in hand, that no certain and uncorrupted lineal blood could be found of the Duke of York, except in the person of Richard, his son, the Duke of Gloucester. And suddenly, Richard III rises to the throne. I think it's, again, convenient is just a key word here. They couldn't accuse anything else. Edward V was too young to be accused of tyranny. He hadn't even started ruling yet. They couldn't suddenly say, look, just like Richard II or just like Henry VI, this is a king who cannot rule. We must set him aside. Richard III had no other argument here other than this, I think, hastily concocted argument of his father's misconduct. Of course, the pre-contract is very important to Ricardians, and it's particularly important to Philip Langley's current arguments, because it is this document that proves, in inverted commas, proves that Richard III had no motive to murder the princes, because why would he need to murder illegitimate nephews? They therefore would have no threat to him dynastically, but that's simply not the case, as we know. Illegitimacy could always be reversed anyway.
Right.
And the pre-contract, again, does seem to have been conjured up out of thin air by Bishop Stillington.
And it also would mean that Edward IV, for his entire reign, had lied, had lived a lie, and had manipulated the succession. So it's a pretty serious accusation against him. I understand you wouldn't want to raise it in his lifetime, but even to raise it after his death is a pretty serious accusation to his memory. So
absolutely, but I believe that Richard III was acting out of sheer desperation by this point of view. It's why I reject the idea that because Richard had allegedly lived his life so loyal to his brother and had been such an upstanding member of the nobility, that's irrelevant in a time of absolute pressure. You're gonna lash out and undertake some actions that are perhaps out of keeping. If you level intense pressure on me, I mean, I'm a Scorpio, so maybe I'm a bad example, but I'm going to lash out aggressively when maybe in times of relative calmness, I could be quite friendly. These people are no different. So I think at this point, he's all in. He has to get rid of the Woodville faction. He's gone too far. He needs the #1 spot. And that's exactly what's happened. So his brother's memory, so what, I guess, at this point to him.
Okay. So then he's focused on Elizabeth Woodville and the two boys. And those are the daughters as well, who are also disinherited, but specifically Elizabeth and the two sons. So Elizabeth when her brother and her son from her first marriage are arrested on Richard's orders, goes into sanctuary. And I've read some comments from the Ricardians that that was unnecessary. That was just sort of showmanship on her part. What do you think? Did she feel threatened? You mentioned Richard feels threatened. Does she feel threatened as well?
Well, I suppose actions speak louder than words. Of course, she threatened. She went into sanctuary. Again,
Mm-hmm.
that's a very convenient argument from Ricardians because they're trying to make Richard look like a benevolent and nice man who's wandered in. Whatever the circumstances of whatever his intentions were, and I do not believe that when he took control of his nephew and entered London, I do not believe he had intentions for the throne or ambitions for the throne. I believe he had simple ambitions to be protector of the realm, but his actions very quickly unraveled before him. But Elizabeth clearly was concerned, and she fled into sanctuary, and not for the first time in her life either. You know, this had happened back during the Lancastrian readeption in 1470. In fact, Edward V was born in sanctuary. You know, the account of Dominic Mancini, who was in London at that time, he mentions that people were saying things like England was too great a realm to be ruled by puny men. Basically saying the Woodvilles are people of no consequence and should not be in charge. If people were saying that around Dominic Mancini, she must have felt a bit uncomfortable as well with the unpopularity. You know, the Woodvilles weren't necessarily a popular dynasty. She would also have received news of her brother being arrested, Earl Rivers. Why is her brother being arrested? She doesn't know. She can't switch the TV on and watch the news. She simply has to bide her time. So she, you know, she rushes into sanctuary. She was in London. It was a safe place just to try and wait out and see exactly what was happening. Now, of course, the problem is that the Yorkists, the House of York, did not necessarily respect sanctuary. They did have a record of breaching sanctuary, so I'm not entirely sure how safe she may have thought she was.
Well, and I think that speaks to her decision to come out of sanctuary and make a deal of sorts with Richard. He's on the throne. The boys have disappeared. And so she agrees to come out of sanctuary months later, which some say, well, obviously she knew Richard didn't kill her boys, or she wouldn't have made this deal with him to come out of sanctuary. I don't agree with that. I think she had very few options by that point, and she was surrounded. I mean, sanctuary is not a picnic to not ever. I mean, we got a little taste during lockdown of not being able to leave. You know, she was in some dire straits and was pressured at that point. So what was that like when she agrees to come out of sanctuary and makes a bit of a deal with Richard?
Well, let's just look at the quick timeline. So on the 14th of June, uh, so 13th of June, Richard of, sorry, my cat is sitting on my keyboard. Right. Let me start there again. So if we look at the timeline, on the 13th of June, that's when Richard of Gloucester, the future Richard III, has essentially made his coup in the council. He's had Hastings executed. He's had a range of people arrested. The following day, the 14th of June, he's written an appeal to the city of York requesting for allies to be sent down because, quote, we need you to aid and assist us against the Queen, her blood, and her affinity, who intend to murder and destroy us. Now, obviously, that was a private letter. I'm not sure if Elizabeth herself would have been aware of that, but she must have been aware of the feelings going around that Gloucester was really ramping things up against the Woodvilles, and that then more troops were on their way. Now, got to consider her position. Her brother, Lord Rivers, and one of her sons, Richard Grey, from the first marriage, have been arrested. Her brother, Edward Woodville, had fled the kingdom, and she was stuck in sanctuary. She was alienated. She was scared. On the 16th of June, 2 days after he wrote this letter, Gloucester actually goes to Westminster by water with the Duke of Buckingham. And apparently their men are armed with swords and bats. And according to the Croyland Chronicle, they surround the Abbey. They send in the Archbishop of Canterbury, and they get him to appeal to her to hand over her youngest son, Richard of York. The idea being that he needs to be handed over so that he can go to be with his brother in the Tower, to comfort his brother, I think the quote is. What choice does she have at this point? Again, the House of York had repeatedly breached sanctuary during the Wars of the Roses to get their way. There were Yorkist retainers who tried to break into sanctuary in Brittany to get Henry Tudor. They were unsuccessful. After the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, sanctuary was breached and 2 of the Beauforts were murdered. And before that, in 1464, after the Battle of Hexham, sanctuary was also breached and another Beaufort murdered. So whatever happened on that day, Richard of Gloucester was getting his hands on his nephew. So Elizabeth had no option than to hand him over. Now, when we fast forward to when she herself decided to come out of sanctuary, so this is March 1484. So what's that? 8-9 months later.
Right.
By this point, Richard is victorious. He's defeated one rebellion against his rule, the Buckingham Rebellion. Parliament has endorsed his title and he's officially king, and all his enemies are subdued. In March 1484, Richard III, with his wife and with his son, has won. There is no more options. The Tudor conspiracy is floundering abroad. They're struggling to get support from the French and from the Bretons. There is nothing happening. Without any hope of, I don't know, imminent relief from this predicament, her spirit would have been diminished. Elizabeth had no real choice than to, well, at least release her daughters to rejoin the court. Again, it was just a matter of time before Richard would have gone in and got what he wanted. But I think what's fascinating here, what's really fascinating, and Ricardo's glossed over this, is how on the 1st of March 1484, in the presence of all of his, his nobility and the church, Richard III had to swear an oath to the London mayor and the officials and so on. He had to swear an oath that if the Woodville girls were released into his care, he would pledge no harm to them, and he would marry them to gentlemen. And I think a key phrase here is they would not be put into the Tower of London. So obviously the Tower of London's already taken on a bit of a meaning there for the Woodvilles. And so she does. She releases her 5 daughters, the Princesses of York, or the former Princesses of York at this point, into his care. Now, Ricardo's just saying, why would she do this? Why would she release first one of her sons and then 5 of her daughters into the care of a man who had allegedly killed her sons? Obviously, she must not have believed they had done this. But we know for a fact that Richard III had already killed one of her sons, and that is Richard Grey from her first marriage. So that argument doesn't hold up. I compare Elizabeth Woodville in this period to Margaret of Anjou earlier during the Wars of the Roses. In 1470, Margaret, because she had no other choice, had to create an alliance with Warwick the Kingmaker, her number one enemy, the man who had toppled her father, her husband, from the throne in the first place. But she had no choice than to make an alliance with him at that point. And Elizabeth Woodville had no choice than to enter a new agreement with the great victor of this period. Nobody could foresee, of course, that Richard's days were numbered.
No. And you're right, because she knew he would have come in and gotten those girls. She did. Do you think, but do you think that his public declaration that the girls would come to no harm was part of their deal, that she wanted him to say publicly that they would be safe, they would come to court, they would not go to the Tower, they would get good marriages?
Absolutely. I mean, think what this says about Richard's reputation. Again, this argument that Richard had such a brilliant, wonderful reputation, and there's no evidence of people speaking out against him during his reign, and this is all Tudor propaganda. Look at this oath he had to swear. What does that say for his prestige? And again, we can argue all we want about history being written by the victors. Well, the reason we don't have much things against Richard III during his reign is because he was the victor. We just have this remarkable oath, and I personally think it says a lot.
Right. And so after that, she does come out of sanctuary. And then, 1484, they don't know it then, but that his days are numbered and someone is coming. Do you think Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort were in contact while Elizabeth was in a sanctuary?
Yeah,
Tell us
yeah.
about that and what, she must have known something was up if she was plotting to help Henry Tudor.
So it's fascinating because Margaret Beaufort has spent the previous 10 years trying to get her son back home. Not to become king like everybody believes, but to simply assume his position as Earl of Richmond. And she was nearly there. She had the agreement ready from Edward IV that her son could come home, and then Edward IV went and died. Now, Margaret has a meeting with Richard III the day before his coronation. And I believe that during this meeting, she's asked Richard, can my son come home? And I think the answer has been negative, because as soon as she comes out to that meeting, she goes straight to work. She starts this plot, this rebellion behind Richard III's back. Now, what Margaret has is a mother's love for her children. She understands and probably sympathizes with Elizabeth Woodville's predicament. I'm not too knowledgeable about what their relationship had been over the previous 10 or so years, but Margaret was a key part of the Yorkish court. They would have known each other. And what they share is they share a Welsh doctor, a chap called Lewis Carleon, Cambridge-educated doctor. I think he's an astronomer, a mathematician. He was everything. Just one of those well-rounded kind of intellectuals. But because he was a doctor, he was allowed to go in and out of sanctuary to see his patient, I guess, his client. So Margaret calls Lewis to her side, explains to him what she wants him to tell tell Elizabeth, which seems to be, we are going to lead a revolution against Richard III. We're going to possibly try and free your sons from the Tower of London, and my son should marry your daughter, and we should bond together the Beaufort, Tudor, Woodville family. Now, there does seem to have been an attack on the Tower of London, led by the Woodville faction. It fails, and a lot of the Woodvilles flee abroad, the Woodville supporters. I would probably suggest that shortly after that, the boys are put to death. I think the fact that there has been an attack on the tower suggests they're a problem, and while Richard is away from London, somebody does the job. But obviously that now changes things a little bit. The boys are now out of the way, and that news may be taken to Elizabeth Woodville by Lewis Carleon. We don't know how or when Elizabeth would have received any. I suppose we would be fair and call them rumours, because we don't know for definite what happened to the boys. But definitely using Lewis Carleon, Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort enter into a bond. The bond that includes marrying their children together. It's a good story. It's mothers' loves coming together, and certainly by the end of the year, with the Duke of Buckingham, another potential claimant to the throne, killed, executed, there's only one man left standing, and that's Henry Tudor. And now this union between Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York takes on a whole another level of importance. But yeah, Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville were in the summer of 1483, up to their eyes in it.
Okay, and that's really interesting too, because there does seem to be a point where Elizabeth Woodville looks beyond the rescue of her sons as a possibility for whatever reason. Then things come to pass, and Henry Tudor comes and he marries Elizabeth, and there's the Tudor regime. But I want to sort of circle back, because Elizabeth Woodville is at court as the mother of the Queen. Margaret Beaufort is, of course, the mother of the King and has a very prestigious position at court. And I want to get the year right, 1487, which is an important year in terms of the rebellions. Elizabeth Woodville retires from court. And again, some Ricardians point to that as evidence that she believes, oh, I guess my son is alive and I'm supporting him, and that Henry VII by this point sends her away from court. So what can you tell us about that?
It's the boring answer as usual. We don't know. We don't know why she retired to court. There's plenty of theories. One of them being, yeah, she was thrown out of court and sent to, as punishment, to Westminster Abbey. One of her biographers, Jane Lane Smith, suggests that she may have just personally have retired there through, pious nature. Her job is done at court, and she retired there. Perhaps she was grief-stricken about her children. We don't know that. There has been a recent suggestion, I believe, that she may have gone there through illness. Abbeys were the hospitals of the day. The point being, there's multiple reasons why she could have decamped. Obviously, the timing leads to much speculation. I think on the surface, it's highly improbable that Elizabeth Woodville was going to be any willing participant in a conspiracy to depose her son-in-law from its hard-won throne, and obviously her daughter from position of queen. Because regardless of the new evidence, I simply don't buy the fact that the rebellions were in favour of her son. The rebellions were in favour of the Earl of Warwick, which was her nephew by marriage. She's not going to depose her daughter, and of course at this point her grandson Arthur, from the throne in favour of Warwick. What's more interesting during this period is I do believe that one of the Woodvilles was potentially involved, and that was her son, Thomas Grey, the Marquess of Dorset. The reason for this is that Thomas Grey had actually been Warwick's guardian before, all of this kicked off. Back between 1480 and 1483, Thomas Grey was Warwick's guardian and controlled Warwick's marriage rights. Thomas Grey is a shady figure. He wasn't respected by Edward IV. He wasn't respected by Richard III, and he escaped to the Tudor court in exile. Then he decided to try and escape from there and come back to Richard III's side. Henry captured him and kept him in France. And when Henry invaded England, he didn't allow Dorset to cross with him. Now, Dorset did eventually come across to join the new Tudor court, but he wasn't given any positions of influence or power. He simply wasn't trusted. He was a complete and utter nobody under the reign of his brother-in-law, Henry VII. So I can imagine Dorset having, the cogs in his mind going, if he can make Warwick a king, he will suddenly be the father-in-law of a king. He will be the number 2 behind the king, because, yes, his sister was queen, but all routes to progress for him were blocked. His sister being queen didn't really do much for him. So I do believe that Thomas Grey was potentially caught up in all of this. And, perhaps his mother did come briefly under the king's eye of, suspicious eye. It's a difficult one. I mean, her withdrawal to Bermondsey could simply have just been a coincidental occurrence. I mean, we also have no evidence to suggest what she thought about any of these pretenders. We certainly know that when she died, she died in 1492, so she didn't get to see the end of the Perkin-Warbeck conspiracy, but she didn't name either of her sons, real or imagined, in her will. She did name Thomas Grey. Obviously, a suggestion being that she didn't name her sons, deceased sons, in her will, because she didn't massively know precisely what happened. What happened to them. It may have simply been that it reopened too many painful memories. Again, she could have retired to Bermondsey because of grief. We do know that she came back to court in 1489 for the birth of her grandson, the future Henry VIII. So she certainly wasn't permanently barred from court. It's a complex period, and I do feel that there's an element of 2 + 2 = 5 in this. You know, we're looking for conspiracies at every corner. We're looking for potential what's been covered up by the Tudor regime, and we just don't have enough evidence. I think by the end of 1487, her job was done. Her daughter was crowned queen. That was a mistake that Henry VII did potentially make. He took too long to have Elizabeth crowned. So once in November 1487, she's crowned. You don't need a dowager queen at court anymore. Margaret Beaufort's effectively playing the role there of Queen Mother. It's a difficult one. That's a long way of saying we don't know the actual answers, and it does lead up once more to create potential avenues to suit a narrative.
Right. And in those days, when everything was so complicated, there are all kinds of avenues to suit all kinds of narratives. But you're right. Once she's already has a grandson, Arthur's born and looking healthy, like he's going to be fine. Elizabeth's crowned. She's kind of done.
My suspicion would be it's a simple money issue. I think Henry VII just simply wasn't willing to fund a dowager queen. She didn't necessarily have much independent wealth of herself, Elizabeth Woodville. I'm cutting your funding, says Henry. She decides to go live in an abbey off their off their coin. The fact she only lives for 5 more years suggests, maybe there were health issues perhaps involved. She's still close enough to London to pop over every now and then from Bermondsey. So I think that's just the most boring, likeliest option.
Right.
But obviously, again, I feel like the new evidence is trying to push. Oh, if she's gone in 1487, then that adds to the idea that her son Edward V is part of this Lambert Simnel conspiracy. I think we're working backwards, not working forwards.
Right. And, the fact that she came back when young Prince Henry was born, that's a pretty important state occasion. If she were really under that much suspicion, it's not likely Henry VII would have had her back in, any kind of official position there. All right. So we come to the end. We're now, Elizabeth Woodville's retired, Henry VII squarely on the throne. He defeats all the rebellions, lasts till the end. Arthur sadly dies, but is then Henry VIII, and then we're really off with the Tudors. But if we look back to the 1483, to that summer and early fall, what are most people thinking? Are most people believing that the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville was invalid? Are most people wondering why Edward V, who is proclaimed king, ends up not being king, and conveniently, there's Richard on the throne? What do people think has happened to the two boys? Do you have a sense of that?
Not massively, because obviously we don't have much written evidence for the thought of the common man. Like I said, mentioned earlier, Dominic Mancini, that Italian churchman who was in London during the first half of 1483, he does suggest that people break out into tears whenever they hear mention made of the Boys of the Tower. Is that an accurate reporting of the reality of the day, or was he simply making an artistic choice of words for his book? We don't know, but there may have been some horrified people around, certainly London at the time. I imagine it's pretty much like we are today. We have all of our opinions about the big political matters of the day, but we're powerless to do anything other than to mention it in passing and get on with it, because we can be outraged at elections and so on, but it's not something that we are going to alter ourselves. So I imagine in 1483 there would be much discussion about matters in the home and in the taverns, but ultimately the king is the king, and onwards you go.
Right. Right. And it looked like Richard, and who had a son, who came with a son, that looked like that was going to be the case for years to come.
And there is, of course, that very famous Bible quote, "Woe unto you when the king is a child."
Mhm.
People may have been concerned that the king was a child, and the Woodvilles certainly were an unpopular family at this period. Richard III was a very capable man. I think, given the opportunity, he could have been a good king. There may not have been too much of an outcry initially with him taking the reins. Of course, by bringing a lot of his northerners down, that would have been suspicious to a lot of the southerners.
Mhm.
So there could have been quite a bit of agitation taking place. But I mean, you just want a stable kingship today, a stable government. Stop changing leaders, stop changing ministers.
Yeah.
Just give us some stability, and it may not even necessarily be for the guy you would vote for.
Just some stability.
Yeah.
Because
And
Edward IV's death was a surprise. He was only 40, so people weren't expecting him to die that year. And so, and the last two child kings were Richard II and Henry VI, and they didn't end well. So there could have been concern.
And this was a period of actually quite a difficult economic scenario, and England and France's briefly, amicable relationship was starting to break down. People were worried there was a war coming.
Yeah.
The 100 Years' War were going to their 200th year. So,
Right.
People might have just been unhappy about what had happened with the boys, because we are humans, but King Richard was a potentially a good king. And similar when Henry VII becomes king. There's not really much discussion about it. It's just on we go. The king is dead. Long live the king.
Right. So let's bring that to a position. We'll think about Henry VII, and I know we're just wrapping up here, but tell us what you are working on now. Speaking of the Tudors.
Well, I'm not working on anything at the moment, but I have finished a book.
Okay.
Which is out next summer. It's called The Son of Prophecy: The Rise of Henry Tudor, and it is basically a 300-year epic covering the rise of one Welsh family from a corner of North Wales to the English throne, the Tudor family. And it does, the last few chapters cover 1483 quite heavily.
Okay.
So it is a book that takes us from 1170 up to Bosworth Field.
Okay. So that's in between or alongside the House of Beaufort, which I have here, and then we'll end up with Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders, which I'll hold up again when I open it. There we go. And then, so this one will bring us up to what happens in the reign of Henry VII. So we'll have the story.
It's my unofficial trilogy that I've ended up making.
That's wonderful. And it'll be out next summer, you say?
Next summer in the UK, probably a couple of months later in the US, but I know you guys can sometimes get hold of UK copies. So.
We do have some ways, and I will share those as well, but we'll be looking for that. I can't wait. We've talked about that, so I'm really excited about that. Well, thank you so much, Nathen. I know you've got so much going on, lots of appearances and lots of articles you're quoted in and all this. So we really do appreciate you coming in to talk about this exciting new evidence, some great discoveries. It's always wonderful to get some new documents and alternative ways of looking at the documents and, setting those bones aside that don't solve the question, but it is a question that continues to go on. So the cold case really has not been solved, but it is an ongoing, fascinating discussion. So thank you so much for joining us.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll be back soon with more fascinating discussions as we keep shaking up history together.